Meghan, a geriatric mother. The family claims and state that Meghan had a hysterectomy. How can a woman with a hysterectomy be pregnant? And most of all, why did the royal family go along with this?
Something about this story feels different, because this isn't just another rumor surrounding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. This is about documents, unanswered questions, and a reaction from Prince William that insiders say changed everything. And now the question is no longer what's being claimed, but why it's being taken seriously at all. It begins not with a public statement, but with a quiet meeting that reportedly took place behind closed doors, a meeting that, according to the material outlined in, was triggered by the sudden arrival of an independent journalist carrying a set of documents that immediately shifted the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace, because what was presented was not a rumor, not a headline, but a collection of files that, if authentic, could raise questions about one of the most sensitive aspects of the modern royal narrative. Because here's what makes this moment so unusual. The claim itself was not announced publicly. It was delivered privately, directly to Prince William. And that alone changes how this story is interpreted. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When something is brought directly to the future king instead of the media, does that suggest credibility or strategy? Because that distinction matters. And according to the narrative described in, the material presented included medical references, contractual language, and communication records tied to the birth of Princess Lilibet, none of which have been publicly verified, but all of which were detailed enough to reportedly force a reaction from Prince William that insiders described as immediate and serious. And this is where the story begins to escalate. Because the issue is not just what the documents claim. It is how they were received. Because reports suggest that Prince William did not dismiss them outright, which raises a question that cannot be ignored. Why not? Because in a system like the monarchy, where false claims are common and often ignored, the decision to even consider something like this suggests that there may have been enough detail to warrant attention, and that alone shifts this from rumor into something far more complex. Now ask yourself this. What kind of evidence would it take for Prince William to even pause and look deeper into something this sensitive? Because that question sits at the center of this entire story. And this is where the emotional dimension begins to build. Because if the situation involves Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, then this is not just institutional. It is personal. It is family. It is trust. And according to reports, that is exactly what makes this moment so difficult, because any investigation, even a quiet one, would not just be about verifying information. It would be about confronting the possibility of something that could reshape relationships permanently. But here's where the tension increases even further. Because the documents, as described in, reportedly include references to medical procedures and legal frameworks that, if interpreted a certain way, could raise questions about how royal succession rules apply, particularly in relation to how births are recorded and recognized within the system. Now pause again and ask yourself this. If even a small part of that framework becomes unclear, what does that mean for something as rigid as the line of succession? Because this is where the story moves from personal into institutional territory. And that is where everything becomes more serious. Because according to long-standing royal protocol, succession is not symbolic. It is legal. It is structured. And it is protected by rules that have remained consistent for generations. So now the question becomes sharper. If those rules are even being questioned, what kind of response would that require from the monarchy? Because that leads directly to the role of King Charles III. Because while Prince William may have received the information, any official action, any acknowledgement, any response at an institutional level would ultimately connect back to the authority of the current monarch. And yet, according to reports, there has been no public statement, no confirmation, no denial. Only silence. And that silence is beginning to shape the narrative. Now ask yourself this. When something potentially serious emerges and the monarchy remains silent, is that a sign of control or caution? Because perception begins to form quickly in moments like this. And perception drives everything. But here's where the story becomes even more layered. Because according to the same narrative, when Prince William reportedly reached out for clarification, the response he received was not direct, not detailed, and not fully reassuring, which only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the situation. And that changes the dynamic completely. Because uncertainty creates space. And space allows speculation to grow. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If clear answers are not being provided, What does that suggest about what is actually known behind the scenes? Because that is where this story begins to move next. From documents, to reactions, to something much harder to contain. And what comes next is where everything starts to shift in a way that no one can ignore. As the initial shock of those reported documents begins to settle, the story doesn't slow down, it deepens, because once something this sensitive reaches Prince William directly, the question is no longer just about what was presented, it becomes about what happens next, and according to the narrative described in, this is exactly where the situation shifts from quiet concern into something far more structured. Something that begins to resemble an internal process rather than a passing rumor. Because here's what changes everything. It wasn't just the existence of the documents that raised concern. It was the level of detail they reportedly contained. Because when information moves beyond vague claims and into specific references, medical terminology, contractual language, timelines, it forces a different kind of reaction, especially inside an institution like the monarchy where precision matters. And that is why reports suggest that Prince William did not simply ignore what was placed in front of him. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. What kind of material would it take for someone in Prince William's position to move from dismissal to quiet verification? Because that question sits at the center of this entire phase. And this is where the story begins to take a more deliberate turn. Because according to the narrative in, what followed was not a public reaction, not a statement, but something far more controlled. A series of private consultations involving legal advisors and constitutional experts, individuals whose role is not to react emotionally, but to assess implications with precision, and that alone tells you how seriously this situation may have been taken behind the scenes. But here's where things become even more complex. Because these consultations were not about confirming a claim. They were about understanding consequences. Because if even a fraction of the material raised questions about how a birth is recorded within royal frameworks, then the issue immediately moves beyond personal narrative and into legal territory, and that is where everything becomes far more serious than it first appeared. So now the question becomes sharper. If a situation has the potential to touch something as sensitive as succession rules, how cautious does the response need to be? Because caution, in this context, is not weakness. It is necessity. And this is where the role of King Charles III becomes impossible to ignore, because while Prince William may be leading quiet inquiries, any action that affects the structure of the monarchy ultimately connects back to the authority of the reigning monarch. And yet, according to reports, there has been no public acknowledgement, no visible intervention, no attempt to address the growing speculation. Only silence. Now ask yourself this. When something potentially serious is being evaluated behind closed doors, does silence indicate control of the situation, or uncertainty about how to respond? Because that distinction changes how this entire moment is interpreted. And this is where the tension continues to build. Because according to the same narrative, when Prince William reportedly sought clarification directly from Prince Harry, the response was not what many would expect in a situation that could be resolved with simple transparency, because instead of detailed explanations or clear evidence, the reaction was described as cautious, limited, and heavily focused on privacy. And that changes everything. Because in situations where clarity could end speculation, hesitation often creates more questions than answers. So now pause again and ask yourself this. If a straightforward explanation could resolve everything, why would it not be provided immediately? Because that is where doubt begins to take shape. And this is where the story moves into a more uncomfortable space. Because according to, the lack of direct clarity reportedly led to a shift in approach, with Prince William moving from informal inquiry to something more structured, something that resembles verification rather than conversation. And that transition is significant, because it signals that the situation is no longer being treated as a misunderstanding. It is being treated as something that requires answers. But here's where the stakes rise even further. Because once a matter moves into structured verification, it creates a timeline, a process, and eventually an outcome, and that outcome, regardless of what it may be, has implications not just for individuals, but for the institution itself, especially when public perception is already beginning to react to the possibility of something being hidden. Now ask yourself this. If an internal review is happening quietly, how long can it remain hidden before it becomes public? Because that question is not theoretical. It reflects the reality of how information moves today. And this is where the external pressure begins to build. Because while internal discussions may remain private, public speculation does not. And according to the narrative, once fragments of this story began circulating, the conversation expanded rapidly, with observers, analysts, and commentators all attempting to interpret what little information was available. And that creates momentum. Momentum that is difficult to control. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If internal verification and external speculation continue at the same time, which one will shape the narrative first? Because perception, once formed publicly, can move faster than any official response. And that is what makes this moment so critical. Because it sits at the intersection of two forces: internal caution and external curiosity. And those two forces rarely stay balanced for long. Now pause and think about this. If the monarchy delays too long in addressing something that the public is already questioning, does that protect the institution or risk damaging trust? Because trust is fragile. And once it begins to shift, even slightly, it affects everything that follows. But here's where the story begins to move toward its next phase. Because according to what started as a private meeting has now evolved into something much larger, something that is no longer confined to a single conversation or a single set of documents, but instead has become a developing situation involving multiple layers: legal, personal, and institutional. And that means one thing: this is no longer contained. So now ask yourself this: are we witnessing a situation that will quietly resolve behind closed doors, or are we watching the early stages of something that will eventually demand a public answer? Because what happens next will determine everything. And what happens next is where the story begins to shift. From quiet investigation to something much harder to control. As the situation moves beyond quiet consultations and into something far more structured, the tone of the story begins to change. Because once internal discussions evolve into organized verification, what we are looking at is no longer curiosity, it is process. And according to the narrative described in, this is exactly where Prince William shifts from simply reviewing what was presented to actively testing it. Not in a public way, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a controlled, methodical approach designed to answer one question above all others: whether anything in those documents holds enough weight to require a formal response. Because here's what changes everything. Once verification begins, it creates a direction. Because verification is not neutral. It leads somewhere. And that means the situation is already moving forward, whether the public can see it or not. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: when a future king initiates a verification process behind closed doors, does that suggest confidence that the issue will be resolved quickly, or concern that the implications could be far greater than expected? Because that question sits at the heart of this phase. And this is where the role of advisors becomes critical. Because according to the narrative, Prince William began working closely with a small group of legal and constitutional experts, individuals whose responsibility is not to speculate, but to interpret how any potential irregularity, no matter how small, could affect the structure of the monarchy. And that is where the conversation reportedly becomes more serious than anyone initially expected. Because the issue is not just about whether a claim is true. It is about what happens if even part of it raises uncertainty. And that is a completely different level of risk. So now the question becomes sharper. If a situation introduces even the possibility of ambiguity within something as rigid as succession rules, how does the monarchy respond without creating even more uncertainty? Because that is the challenge. And that is where the tension begins to intensify. Because according to the discussions inside these consultations reportedly moved quickly from reviewing documents to mapping scenarios, considering outcomes, and evaluating how different possibilities, confirmed or unconfirmed, could impact public trust, institutional stability, and the credibility of the royal family as a whole. And that changes the entire perspective. Because now this is no longer about a single claim. It is about potential consequences. Now pause again and ask yourself this: if a situation requires mapping out multiple worst-case scenarios, what does that suggest about how seriously it is being taken internally? Because that is where the story becomes even more layered. And this is where the connection to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle becomes even more sensitive, because if communication between them and Prince William has already become strained, as reports suggest, then any attempt to resolve the situation quietly becomes far more difficult, because without direct clarity, the process relies entirely on external interpretation rather than internal confirmation. And that creates a problem. Because interpretation can never fully replace transparency. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If clarity is not coming from those directly involved, where does the process go next? Because that is exactly where the narrative begins to shift again. Because according to the same accounts, The lack of detailed responses reportedly led Prince William to move toward a deeper level of verification, one that goes beyond conversation and into documentation analysis, timeline reconstruction, and cross-referencing available information. And that shift is significant, because it indicates that the situation is no longer being treated as something that can be resolved through explanation alone. It requires evidence. But here's where the stakes rise even further. Because once a process reaches that level, it creates momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop. Because every new piece of information leads to another question. Every unanswered detail creates another layer of uncertainty. And over time, that accumulation begins to form a narrative of its own. Now ask yourself this: if a situation continues to generate more questions than answers, how long before those questions begin to define the story completely? Because that is where public perception begins to take shape. And perception moves quickly, often faster than verification. And that creates pressure. Pressure on the institution. Pressure on individuals. Pressure on timing. Because at some point, silence is no longer enough. But here's where the story becomes even more intense. Because while all of this is happening internally, according to, fragments of the situation have already begun to circulate more widely, with discussions appearing across media platforms and online communities, each adding their own interpretation, each shaping the narrative in real time. And that is where the situation begins to move beyond control. Because once a story reaches that stage, it is no longer contained by those investigating it. It becomes public, and that changes everything. So now pause and ask yourself this: if the public begins forming conclusions before the process is complete, how does the monarchy regain control of the narrative? Because that is the challenge moving forward. And that is why this moment feels so critical. Because it sits at the intersection of two timelines. The internal timeline of verification, and the external timeline of perception. And those two timelines rarely align perfectly. And when they don't, tension increases. So now the question becomes even more direct. Will the truth, whatever it may be, emerge through controlled process, or through uncontrolled exposure? Because that is where this story is heading next. And what comes next is where everything begins to shift from quiet evaluation to something much harder to contain. As the internal verification process continues to unfold, the situation begins to reach a point where it can no longer remain purely analytical, because once questions accumulate, timelines are reconstructed, and inconsistencies, real or perceived, start to align, the narrative naturally moves toward one unavoidable phase, and that is response. And according to the evolving account outlined in, this is exactly where Prince William begins to shift from quiet evaluation into something far more decisive, not yet public, not yet confrontational, but clearly no longer passive. Because here's what changes everything. At some point, investigation creates pressure, and pressure demands direction. And that direction, once chosen, cannot easily be reversed. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this: when a future king reaches a stage where remaining neutral is no longer possible, what kind of decision does he make? Because that question sits at the heart of this entire phase. And this is where the role of King Charles III becomes increasingly critical, because while Prince William may be leading the internal effort to understand the situation, any formal step, any institutional acknowledgement, any structured action, must align with the authority of the reigning monarch. And yet, according to reports, there has still been no public clarification, no official response. Only a continuation of silence that is now beginning to carry more weight than words themselves. But here's where the tension becomes sharper. Because silence, over time, stops being neutral. It becomes interpreted. And interpretation becomes narrative. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If something is being examined internally and the public remains unaware of the outcome, how long before that gap between knowledge and perception begins to create its own consequences? Because that gap is where uncertainty grows. And uncertainty is where speculation thrives. And this is where the situation begins to move beyond control. Because according to the narrative as internal review continued, external attention also intensified, with more voices attempting to interpret what was happening, more discussions forming around the implications, and more pressure building on the monarchy to respond in some way, even if only to stabilize the narrative. And that changes everything. Because once external pressure reaches a certain level, it begins to influence internal timing. Now pause again and ask yourself this. If public curiosity begins to outpace internal verification, does the institution respond early, or risk losing control of the story entirely? Because that is the dilemma. And this is where the emotional dimension returns. Because beyond structure, beyond legal frameworks, beyond institutional stability, there is something far more human at the center of this situation. And that is the relationship between Prince William and Prince Harry, a relationship already shaped by distance, tension, and unresolved history. And if reports of strained communication are accurate, then any escalation of this situation carries consequences that extend far beyond protocol. Because this is not just about documents. It is about trust. So now ask yourself this. If trust between brothers has already been weakened, what happens when a situation arises that requires complete transparency? Because that is where the story becomes even more complex. And this is where the response from Meghan Markle and Prince Harry continues to play a critical role, because according to reports, their approach has remained consistent, focused on privacy, legal protection, and limiting the spread of information rather than directly addressing the details being questioned. And while that approach may be understandable from a personal perspective, it also leaves a vacuum where clarity could exist. And that vacuum matters. Because in the absence of clarity, interpretation fills the space. Now ask yourself this. If clear answers are not provided when questions reach this level, what does that suggest to those watching from the outside? Because perception, once formed, becomes difficult to change. And that is where the institutional risk begins to grow. Because the monarchy does not operate solely on authority. It operates on credibility. And credibility depends on trust. But here's where the story takes another critical turn. Because according to the narrative, Prince William is no longer just evaluating possibilities, he is reportedly preparing for outcomes, considering how the monarchy would respond under different scenarios. Whether the situation resolves quietly, remains unclear, or requires a more structured acknowledgement, and that preparation is significant, because it signals that the situation has reached a level where inaction is no longer sustainable. And that changes the entire trajectory. Because once preparation begins, it leads toward action. Now pause and think about this. If preparation is already underway behind the scenes, how close are we to a moment where something becomes visible publicly? Because that moment, when it arrives, will define everything that follows. And this is where the story begins to move toward its most critical point. Because the intersection of internal readiness and external pressure rarely remains stable for long. Eventually, something shifts. Eventually, something emerges. Eventually, something has to be addressed. So now the question becomes even more direct. Are we approaching a controlled resolution, where the situation is clarified quietly and stability is maintained? Or are we moving toward a moment where the narrative breaks into the public in a way that cannot be contained? Because that is where this story is heading next. And what happens next will not just shape how this situation is understood. It will shape how the monarchy itself is perceived moving forward. As everything now converges into this final phase, the story no longer feels like a contained internal matter. It begins to resemble a moment that could redefine how the monarchy manages truth, perception, and public trust. Because once an issue reaches the intersection of family, law, and global attention, the outcome is never just about resolution. It becomes about legacy, and according to the narrative outlined in, this is exactly where the situation involving Prince William, Prince Harry, and Meghan Markle reaches its most critical point, not because everything has been revealed, but because everything is now being interpreted. Because here's what changes everything. At this stage, the question is no longer what the documents contain. It is how the monarchy chooses to respond to the existence of those questions. Because response defines narrative. And narrative defines perception. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this. When an institution built on centuries of tradition faces a modern wave of uncertainty, does it protect itself through silence or through clarity? Because that decision shapes everything that follows. And this is where the role of King Charles III becomes impossible to ignore, because while Prince William may have carried the weight of internal evaluation, any visible outcome, any structured response, any shift in how this situation is handled publicly ultimately reflects the authority of the reigning monarch. And yet, according to reports, the palace has maintained its position of restraint, offering no direct confirmation or denial. But here's where the tension reaches its peak. Because silence, when sustained long enough, stops being neutral. It becomes interpreted as intention. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If clarity could stabilize the situation, why has it not been provided? Because that is where doubt begins to solidify. And that is where public perception begins to move beyond curiosity into something stronger. And this is where the stakes become institutional. Because according to the narrative what began as a private exchange of documents has now evolved into a broader conversation about trust, about transparency, and about whether the monarchy can maintain credibility in an environment where information, verified or not, moves faster than any official process. And that changes everything. Because credibility is not just about truth. It is about timing. It is about communication. It is about how uncertainty is handled. Now pause again and ask yourself this. If an institution delays its response while public interpretation continues to grow, does that preserve authority or weaken it over time? Because that is the balance the monarchy is now facing. And this is where the emotional dimension returns with full force. Because beyond structure and perception, there are real relationships at the center of the situation, particularly between Prince William and Prince Harry, a relationship already shaped by distance and tension. And if this situation has deepened the divide, then the consequences extend far beyond public narrative into something far more personal and difficult to repair. So now the question becomes even more difficult. When duty to the institution and loyalty to family come into conflict, which one ultimately defines the decision? Because that is the dilemma at the core of this story. And that is what makes this moment feel so significant. Because it is not just about what has happened. It is about what this moment represents moving forward. A turning point. A test. A moment where the monarchy must decide how it adapts to a world where uncertainty cannot simply be ignored. But here's where everything comes together. Because regardless of what the internal findings may be, regardless of how the situation is ultimately resolved, one thing is already clear. The narrative has shifted. Because once questions of this magnitude enter public conversation, they do not simply disappear. They reshape how everything is viewed. And that means the future is already being influenced. Not by confirmed facts alone, but by perception. And perception, once formed, is incredibly difficult to reverse. Now pause and think about this. Are we witnessing a moment that will quietly pass once clarity emerges? Or are we looking at the beginning of a deeper shift in how the monarchy interacts with transparency, accountability, and public trust? Because that question does not end here. It carries forward. And what happens next will determine how this moment is remembered. So now it comes down to you. After everything you've heard, after considering the roles of Prince William, Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and King Charles III, do you believe this situation will resolve through quiet clarification, or do you think it signals a larger shift in how the monarchy handles sensitive issues in the future? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective matters. And if you want more deep, high-retention breakdowns that go beyond headlines and uncover the real dynamics behind stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay connected. Because the next development in this story may not just add to the narrative. It might completely redefine it.